Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar series run by Kaizen Synergy Law Firm. My name is Nihal Samara. I'm the General Counsel and Legal Director here at Kaizen Synergy Law Firm, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's session. As today's session is the first session that we are running in 2023, I'd like to say Happy New Year to all of you, and let's look at moving with the governance, risk, and compliance sessions. It's important as part of the initial rollout for agencies and as people return back to work to get on top of some of their governance, risk, and compliance sessions. These webinar series that we are running will run all the way right through to the end of this financial year, and we will be running these sessions weekly as well too. They are open governance, risk, and compliance sessions run by our law firm. And what we are going to do is give you a roadmap of the governance, risk, and compliance obligations covering off key legislation that your agency needs to know about. And essentially, by the end of this financial year, you should have a set of resources, including policy templates and calendars that you can use within your agency to essentially manage all of your governance, risk, and compliance session. So today's session is really an overview of the key areas and some of the regulators that we are going to be covering off in the upcoming weeks and months as well. As always, we'd like to pay our respects to the elders past and present upon the lands on which we all meet. While this session is being run by webinar and recorded, we do pay our respects to the traditional owners accordingly. So today's agenda is an overview of the governance, risk, and compliance obligations, and we're going to be essentially setting up a pathway of what are the obligations that your agency needs to know about and also cover. Now, at the start and end of each of these webinars, which will usually run for only anywhere from about 15 to 20 minutes, and we will keep them moving along. If you do have questions, you can reach out to us, and we're more than happy to support you on that as well too, especially coming out of the webinar. So essentially today's session is an overview of the governance standards. At the start, as I was about to mention, at the start and the end of each webinar, we will give you a set of recommendations. This idea of this is to ensure that you know where we are going and also what you're going to get out of it really quickly at the start of each session. And also, importantly, what are the take-home messages that you should be looking at from week to week? So obviously, reviewing the governance standards is one part of what we're going to be covering today. We are opening up the Gemba 360 dashboard for those of you that don't already have it, which is our governance, risk, and compliance tool used by not-for-profit agencies and community services organizations right around the country. From here, you can access recordings of this webinar, along with also any legal templates and resources that we will refer to. Now, how you can get to there, and it is something that you all can access. You can go directly to our website, which is our law firm's website at kaizensynergy.com, and you will find information on the Gemba 360 dashboard and system as well. One of those is also on, I'll call it directly, the pricing chart, and we have opened this up as a single seat to allow attendees to jump in and start accessing some of the resources as well too. Obviously, if you do open this out to other personnel within your agency, then there is a cost attached to it. Now, that being said, if you did want to jump straight into the dashboard, you can go directly to the Gemba 360 link, and this will open it up, and you can simply go to gemba360.com, and if you do that, you'll go to this big blue button here. This is the resource essentially that you can put in your username and login details. I can see a few questions are coming up already. If you don't already have those, we will send those out to you after today's session. Once you log in, the resources you'll be able to find the past webinars in the Gemba 360 College, and this is a full e-learning management system which you can access, as well as the self-assessment tools which are on the left-hand side of the toolbar here, and one of those which we will be focusing on in the upcoming weeks, and you will all have access to, is the governance, risk, and legal compliance checklist tool. And when I open that up, here it is here. This is the checklist tools. You'll see there's questions on cybersecurity, the minimum standards for working with partners and what you need to look at. We will also be looking at safeguarding checklists and also other regulators as well. So these are checklist tools that we will be opening up, and you can see that you will have access to all of these information as well. And you can see here that you've got access to the all of the previous webinars that we have run, especially during COVID as well. So you can access Gemba 360 quite simply, as I mentioned, by going to gemba360.com, and you will be getting your login details. This is the resource that you can use to access our portal information that we will be going through. So let's have a look at what we are talking about here when we mention about governance, risk, and compliance. Well, essentially, when I go through and look at what are the rules that your agency needs to cover, and there are a myriad of different legislation and rules. Now, I will come back to this slide, because essentially what we do find is when we look at governance, risk, and compliance, one of the big questions that we actually ask agencies when we deliver these training sessions on site is really, who is looking at you? Why is governance, risk, and compliance so important for your agency? Well, essentially, when you look at who is looking at you, it is a raft of different regulators, even before we consider what legislation there is. If you're a not-for-profit agency or a fund, you might be you'll be regulated within the ACNC, or the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profit Commission. You might also be registered as a company or a company limited by guarantee, and subject to ASIC reporting requirements, or essentially under the Incorporations Act in different states and territories. If you're an Indigenous registered corporation, then you'll be registered under the Office of Registrar of Indigenous Corporations. And of course, there are a range of other state and Commonwealth regulators, including places like Fair Work, the Taxation Office, privacy obligations for the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner as well. If you deliver services under the disability programs like the NDIS or medical and health services, then you may also be need to meet the relevant APRA or NDIS obligations as well. That doesn't also then include WorkSafe or work health and safety obligations. So there are a myriad of different regulators that essentially in your agency you need to ensure that you meet your governance, risk, and compliance rules. Now, all of these regulators have different rules, as you will be well aware of. And so apart from these regulators, when we put this up, a lot of people will identify and say, yeah, we need to meet all these different rules and regulators coming out. And, oh, did you hear about what happened with Fair Work? And, oh, did you hear about what happened with the new policy requirements or governance standards under the ACNC? But one of the groups that they actually tend to forget about is both the members, if you're a not-for-profit agency, or the community members that you also serve as well too. And that, of course, is governed under your individual company rule books. So that's why we've included who is looking at you. Well, it is actually your members and also the community that you serve. And that's important when we do look at governance, risk, and compliance obligations. Now, what does that mean for you, and how do you actually manage all of these requirements? Well, essentially, if I just go back one slide, and when we look at, firstly, I'll just look at the left-hand side, how we've actually designed this webinar series for you, is to look at individual, and I'll start at the top, compliance checklists and functions. So essentially, as we're going through each week, we'll show you different compliance tools. This might include self-assessment tools that you can use within your agency. Some of these are quite a simple yes-no type of answer. But what those will give you is to look at all the different requirements that you need to show. And we're going to run through the governance standards and also some of the fair work obligations today at a higher level. But essentially, when we talk of the legislation, and I'm just going to jump between these two slides, then essentially the legislation of all of these different regulators is actually different pieces of laws that each of these regulators expect you to follow. And this legislation is then, if you look at the left-hand side after the legislation is there, you then have ministerial orders in terms of directives of what the minister's interpretations of these might be. You then have the regulators that are really responsible for enforcement or education, or might provide directives of what you need to look at. And then each of these individual regulators might also have, if I just jump back to these slides, their own policy directives that you're also expected to look at as part of your guidance notes. So what we have done, and over the next few months, what we're going to be doing each week is essentially picking out key components of what you need to be aware of, starting with your governance areas first as well, and looking at, well, what are the legislation, any ministerial orders, regulatory directives that they have published, and what are the policy directives that when I say they, the regulators are focusing on. And essentially from there, what you've then got access to is the self-assessment tools. Once you complete that each week, it shouldn't take you more than, I'm going to say, a few minutes to actually do, if you like, after each of the sessions. But the idea is that if you do have any questions on these as you're going through it, and I will just jump back to our dashboard. Here we are here. The idea of this is that once you essentially log into your dashboard, you can access it. And if you have any questions, let's say I'm going through the governance, risk and compliance checklist, and let's say I start working through this. And if I do have questions, then you can directly use the chat group here. And this allows you to talk directly with our legal compliance teams, and it gives you that instant access. So I'm going to come back to this from week to week as well too, because it is a valuable resource that yourselves can actually utilize and essentially start to view all of these documents on. What this gives you is, apart from when I spoke to an agency this morning, when you look at some of the checklists that the regulators do put out, the problem with this is that you then go, well, if I answer no to some of the checklists, what does that mean? Is there any policy templates that I can look at? Where is the line in the sand that I need to look at? And that's the idea that we'll put up in terms of giving you the ability to action and maintain your governance, risk and compliance areas. And we're going to summarize the individual regulators over the upcoming months for you as well too. The idea of this webinar series is quite simply that across your governance, risk and compliance. Oh, and I can see a question coming up already. Yes, we will be covering things like risk registers for you as well too, to look at organizational risks as well, and board reporting measures. So the legal resources essentially that you'll get access to is the calendars, the checklist, the policies, and of course the portal access. But the idea is that as you're working through this, we'll actually prioritize the key areas that your agency can of course look at. Well, let's look at the overview of the governance obligations, and we're going to look at specifically some of the, not just these 6 or so standards, but we're going to look at what are the policy directives that your agency really needs to be across as a priority in the first few weeks of this year as we move forward. So we are going to look at a summary of 4 topics as we're going through. If you are unable, and thank you, Jean, who's just asked a question, unable to log into the portal, we are just updating some of those resources as this webinar progresses, but we will update that for you as well too. So The governance, so essentially there are a number of standards that many of you would be across, especially if you're registered as a not-for-profit agency under the ACNC. So the governance standards require a number of different areas. And if we scroll through these, there are 6 that you need to maintain. These includes ensuring that your purposes are not-for-profit in nature, you have accountability to members, your compliance with Australian laws, which is what this webinar series is about. And I will add that a charity must not commit a serious offence such as fraud under any Australian law or breach a law that may result in a penalty of up to 60 penalty units. So it is important about your legal compliance areas, and this is actually taken directly off the ACNC website itself. Standard 4 talks about suitability of people, where a charity must take reasonable steps to ensure that responsible people, such as board committees or trustees, are not disqualified. And of course, now, obviously also look at that they do have director IDs as well too, but there are some charities that may not need director IDs, and we'll come to that next week as well too. Also, Standard 5 talks about duties of responsible people as well, and a charity must take reasonable steps to make sure that its responsible people are subject to and understand and carry out duties set out in Governance Standard 5. Now, when we look at Standard 6, it talks about maintaining and enhancing public trust and confidence in the Australian not-for-profit sector. And this means that a charity must take reasonable steps to become a participating non-government institution if the charity is or likely to be identified as being involved in the abuse of a person, either under the Child Sexual Abuse Redress Act or National Redress Operations Scheme, which is why we're going to look at child safe standards and ensure that your agency has those particular requirements underway as well too. Now, there are, when you look at this, and we've had conversations, as I mentioned today, with a number of agencies that have said, look, they've jumped onto the different regulatory sites. And of course, the key governance areas that keep coming up is these governance toolkits. And I will add that we're not affiliated with the ACNC in any way, or any regulator as well. So idea of it is that we're going to look at taking the specific toolkits of what different regulators provide and policy documents, as I mentioned in this previous slide here. If I just go back, and we will take policy directives, as you can see, as well as different regulatory positions, and also make those available to you in your Gemba 360 portal. So what does that then mean for your agency? Well, when you look at these governance standards, and also under the ORIC legislation as well too, for those agencies registered under the Office of the Registrar of Indigenous Corporations, essentially there are 4 different areas that are being focused on. And these includes financial abuse, cybersecurity, which we ran a few webinars on last year, working with partners, safeguarding vulnerable people, and also looking at the regulatory requirements for areas like fair work. Now, when you look at the governance reporting and the standards, it is very broad in terms of what you need to meet. So what does that mean for your agency? Well, if we take a risk management approach and you look at what risks your agency has from a governance, risk and compliance approach, then essentially under directives coming out of ASIC and the ACNC, it says that community service organisations should put in place good standards of governance and accountability to manage, reduce the risk of terrorism financing, fraud, and other forms of abuse. Now, what does that actually mean? Well, we've summarised these down into the following slides for you. Essentially, financial abuse means that is a term that covers a number of issues, including instances of bribery, corruption, financial fraud, improper use of misappropriation of community services funds. So if you are a funded agency through state or Commonwealth governments, this applies to you. And also understand that you have a process to manage your financial obligations. And what we have done now is, and I will just jump back to your portal, is that we have set up this under the governance, risk, and legal compliance checklist. Now, if you click on that button, what will come up is this form here, add a new entry. And let me just make this screen slightly bigger so that yourselves can see it a lot more clearer. So let's just go in. I'm just going to click on this here, and we're just going to make this screen slightly bigger. Here we are here. We've just made it up to 125%. So you can see that I've simply gone in and I've clicked on the add a new entry. Now this is individually for each of the agencies that are joining us on these webinars. So you can actually go in, have a look at financial abuse checklist, and these are the key requirements that your agency needs to meet. Now you should be able to mark yes for all of these answers. Once you go through it, you can simply scroll down and click on save, and this will allow you to start to work through this self-assessment tool. What we have done is summarized and taken tools from the ACNC site as well as ASIC as well too. We've looked at other government regulators as well and merged these together based on where your agency is located, and also looked at the legal compliance obligations as well. Now, each one of these, for example, and let me pick up one. So when we look at the standard that says financial abuse, it says that has a documented financial abuse risk assessment. Now, if you say, yes, we do have a document, but the problem is most agencies turn around and go, oh, look, I'm not sure whether we actually do have a document that meets the reported requirements. Now, I have just been asked by Lena. Hi, Lena. Happy New Year. We do have the governance, risk, and legal compliance tool, which is being updated. It should appear on the left-hand side of your toolbar, and it says governance, risk, and legal compliance section. So they just might be updating it while we're running this webinar if you can't already see it. So the governance, risk, and legal compliance form will appear on this toolbar here. When you click on that, it'll open up and you can add a new entry. So what we're going to be looking at, and let's be quite clear about this, is that you might actually have a policy that says, yes, we document financial abuse risk assessment, but is it up to standard? Where is the line in the sand that you need to meet it? Well, over the next few weeks, we're going to go through these bit by bit and actually provide you with the relevant templates that you can use to meet these requirements as well. Now, when we look at other key areas as well, being cybersecurity, again, the standard requires you as to ensure that all charities are vulnerable to cybersecurity risks. And we've seen this just even with agencies like Optus and Telstra and Medibank as well too, where there were significant hacking and data breaches and viruses and phishing. And it means that as a standard that you also, as an agency, need to recognize issues of cybersecurity and how they may affect operations is crucial for your agency. It is just as important that charities know how to mitigate these risks as well too. So again, what we've also brought this up into, and I'll just jump back to your form as well too, under your governance, risk, and cybersecurity, is again summarizing these down. Now, again, we've taken some of these directly from the different regulator sites, and you'll see that the first one on here actually says, okay, yes, you've got a clear policy, guidelines, or procedures for cybersecurity issues. Now, many agencies do have these, but again, so they might tick that. But the question then comes out, well, is it up to par? What are the specific standards and policy requirements that we actually need to meet, and how can I ensure that we meet that? So those are the things that we are going to be looking at over the next week and key topics that your agency needs to look at. The third area, which will be over the next weeks, is working with partners. Now, this has had some substantial changes over the last few months, and we were going to actually issue a number of policy documents last year. But there have been some legal compliance changes on this, and most of that does actually relate to COVID rules as well, where many charities actually develop working relationship with partners from other charities and not-for-profits to businesses, commercial enterprises as well too. So charities yourselves must ensure that your relationships with partners are well planned supported with solid agreements, and it is important that you meet your charitable purposes. So again, there are key requirements that you're being assessed against. And this is essentially coming out of the key toolkits that regulators are essentially asking you to follow. The last ones of this is safeguarding vulnerable people. And remember, these are the 4 big ticket items that we're going to be focusing on. Now, safeguarding is protecting the welfare and human rights of people that are in some ways connected with your charity. And you need to be able to demonstrate this. And it is as part of your charity's primary duty of care. So charities must be able to recognize vulnerability actually in your staff, volunteers, beneficiaries, and partners. And remember, this is coming literally carbon copy out of the regulators itself. It is also critically important that every charity responds to incidents of safeguarding appropriately as well. So to make this clear, what we have looked at, and if I just bring this back to your dashboard as well, you'll see when you click on the governance, risk, and compliance tools that you've got the headings financial abuse checklists, cybersecurity, working with partners, safeguarding of all of your areas. Now, down the bottom of each section, you do have the ability to add your comments in. So you can say, we have marked yes to all of these, or no even to all of these. So let's say we have marked yes to some and no to others. And we will be looking at these over the next few weeks. Okay. Now, each of these portals that you get access to is only viewed by your agency as well too. So it's important that this is not a shared portal by any means, but allows you to get general access directly to it. And essentially it is for you to be able to view. And you can make your own notes. And we've got some 6,500 agencies that are doing this as we speak on this system as well. So those are the key areas that we'll be focusing on. The next part of this that we will then also move on to is looking at what we call making sense of the regulators. So as I mentioned previously, there are a large number of regulators right across the board that your agency does need to look at. And there's a myriad of them. And it can be quite overwhelming to ensure that you meet the requirements of all of these. So what we are doing as part of this whole process is, and we've just used safe work as an example, as a pure example only today, is to look at things like, well, as people are doing things like returning to work, looking at obviously tools that are coming out of that, how to actually make those assessments on there. If there are changes to especially things like COVID obligations, which still continue to run in the background, well, what does that mean? And how does that also cover your work, health, and safety obligations within your agency as well? So those are the sorts of things that we're looking at. You will find that these checklists are there, and you can also print those off as well too, and utilize those across your agency as well. And we will be covering all of these off. So with it, our recommendations are quite straightforward of this. We do suggest that you actually go back, and I'll just update the recommendations that we are showing for you, is that you review the governance standards that we did cover off today, have a look at accessing your Gemba 360 dashboard, and start looking at the self-assessment tools, which includes the legal templates as well too. If you do have any questions, by all means, reach out to us on any of these numbers, or you can also use the chat line as well too. Next week, we will be introducing the child safe standards that agencies do need to follow, especially as part of those protecting vulnerable persons as well, and then moving directly across all of the specific compliant governance, risk, and compliance obligations that your agency needs to meet. More than happy to stay online and answer any questions that you might have. Today's session was just the introduction and show you the process of where we are going. I can see that there are a number of questions that are joining, that people are putting up. If you have to leave, I will say thank you for your time today. We look forward to seeing you next week. If you do have any questions, by all means, reach out to us. and we'll see you next week. If you do have any other questions, by all means, stay online and happy to answer any of those before we finish off in the next few minutes.